Hello and welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So happy to have you all back for part two of the Tribal Engagement Workshop. If you will, feel free to introduce yourself into the chat. We want to know who's in the room. We want to know who we're talking to today. Let's talk a little bit about this webinar's format. This webinar is being recorded. You all will see webinar materials and resources, survey links after the webinar. If you are not so familiar with Zoom, what we're asking is folks to be really active in the chat this go around. Also, I believe you may have the option to come off mute. So folks, raise their hands when they want to speak during dialogue time. I believe you have the functionality to come off mute and speak. Other than that, let's engage in really thoughtful conversation today. I need all folks to be present with us today. And without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of our engagement today. All right, so to do some context setting, right? We know that in a lot of cases, our public systems neglect to address homelessness because, they're not designed to support the most vulnerable groups of people. And so like, what people am I talking about? I'm talking about historically disenfranchised populations of color. I'm talking about our tribal indigenous population specifically. And so when we think about, persistent overrepresentation of tribal and indigenous populations in homelessness, we think about those really serious implications for population health disparities, racial and ethnic disparities. And so we are specifically having these conversations because, again, policymakers give this much attention. They give really little attention to these issues and factors related to homelessness, related to pathways into homelessness, related to outcomes of services and programs to address homelessness amongst these populations. And so I want to plug this in here too. As part of our Cal Racial Equity Action Lab initiative is to identify strategies to work alongside, have communities to address homelessness that ignores, race and the impact of racial discrimination, and to invite those with lived expertise, right? To invite those closest to the problems, the solutions, to invite the decision makers to the table so that we can meaningful and intentionally address the problems that contribute to homelessness and disparities for tribal and indigenous populations. So if you all will please join us in taking a hard look of how, entrenched policy has perpetuated homelessness for tribal indigenous communities by joining phase 2 of our California Real initiative. And with that, I am going to pass this to Lori, Vavila, and Albert. Thank you. You know what, before I pass this, next slide, please. Let me introduce who we are. Today with us, Regina Cannon from C4 Innovation, served as part of our leadership and design team for the California Real project. Also, Dr. Lamont Green, along with a host of other really brilliant coaches and consultants that lead racial equity initiatives in partnership with us. And so I'm just really happy to introduce a small part of our team before passing this on to Albert, Lori, and Vavila. Thank you.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Nastasia, and for grounding us. Next slide, please. Aloha, Maika Kakao, and mahalo for being in community with us today. My name is Lori Pampilo Harris. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Kanaka Mo'olai, native to the islands of Hawaii. We were the inhabitants since time immemorial when goddess Pele, she who shapes our land, pulled our islands out of the ocean. I'm currently working and living in Chicago, the traditional land of the Potawatomi Indians and of the Pokagon Band. Chicagoland area is home to the largest number of Native Americans in the Midwest, over 65,000. The land I walk was and remains native land. We are all on native land. I'm going to now let Vavila introduce herself, and then we're going to move on to Albert.
Thank you so much, Lori. Welcome, everybody. It's so wonderful to have you with us today. My name is Vavila. Please feel free to call me V in a pinch. I'm a descendant of the Choctaw Nation. I'm an individual with lived experience in homelessness, and I am serving as the tribal liaison for the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. With that, it is my great honor to pass the torch to Mr. Albert Tittman, a very valued community member and guest today.
Kachi, Kaniasis Albert Tittman, Tumale, Nisnan, Miwok, Maidu, and my grandmother is a Medici band of the Pit River Nation. It's my honor to share a piece of my spirit with you all today. I am representing Nisenan people, Miwok people, Maidu people in this region today, and all of our ancestors as we acknowledge the land that all of us are on today. And I am also someone with lived experience as an unhoused person. And this cohort really speaks true to my spirit. And so I'm honored to offer this blessing. Joseletli, Kanaskayat Tewale, Deke Kamo, Tepani, Deke Kamo, Huke, Kaku, Susapo, Ajijimo, Ereta, Sawana, Wanga, Nixika. And we just offer gratitude to the creator of this great earth and to Mother Earth herself for giving us this day to be in the presence of our ancestors. And so we say thank you to our ancestors for all the beauty, the strength, the resiliency that they passed forward through all the hardships they endured. We offer gratitude to the relatives sometimes we forget about, and that's the relatives of the water spirit, relatives of the air. Without the relatives, we don't exist as human beings. And we offer gratitude to our plant relatives, to our animal relatives that provide nourishment. They provide food and clothing and spiritual tools, medicine. And we say thank you to our human relatives, the ones that have coordinated this meeting, this cohort, the ones, all of you that continue to do this good work in support of our unhoused. And we say thank you to each and every one of our participants here. And we send special prayers to your heart, to your mind, and to your families, that you can continue to serve our people in this good way. So we come in a blessed way today, in a grateful way.
Oh, thank you so much, Albert, for getting us started in a good way. With that, we'll continue to the next slide. Thank you. So, back one, please. Thank you very much to housekeeping. Thank you very much. So, a couple notes on housekeeping. So, as was mentioned earlier, we're in webinar mode, and so you can see us, but we cannot see you. We will have several times to converse today. When that happens, please locate the hand at the bottom of your Zoom screen and raise your hand to let us know that you want to speak. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. However, I encourage you to also, if you can, wait until the end, because we're going to have a time set aside for questions and answers. A few other notes. So go back to the slide, please, the housekeeping. Thank you very much. So in our communications, we will want to only share what is our truth. We'll want to avoid generalizations, speak from our heart, honor the diversity of all of our perspectives. And then if you have an issue that you would like to connect about, please feel free to reach out to me directly and we can talk about that offline. But also be sure to avoid any identifying information should you be sharing any situations as we talk about things today. Thank you again. Next slide, please. Excellent. We'll go straight into our land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that Sacramento is the homeland of the Patwin, Wintun, Southern Maidu Valley and Plains Miwok, the Nisenan people and members of the Wilton Rancheria, who have inhabited this landscape since time immemorial. We extend our gratitude to the ancestors of all California Native American tribes and their descendants, as we recognize that wherever we are joining from in our virtual community, we are all on California Native American land. We recognize, or except I'll just acknowledge Lori, she's on Chicago land. We recognize that the systemic inequities created by the negative impacts of colonization, past and present. We stand committed to dismantle ongoing legacies of oppression that have dispossessed California Native Americans of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination. And thank you again. The next slide, please. Okay. This week, we'll be recapping our main takeaways from the last session. We'll provide tips on how to prepare yourself and your organization for engagement and partnership. We're going to be touching upon culture, how culture impacts communication, and we'll provide tips on how to be successful in that communication. We'll also discuss how and who to contact in tribes and urban Native American communities, address challenges in engagement, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of today. And there will be a few discussions, so we look forward to our conversations in the future. Next slide, please.
Thanks for overviewing our agenda, V. So we're going to just take a moment here to remind ourselves we're getting ready to journey through more information that may elicit emotions, may elicit experiences, elicit memories that you may have. When we're thinking about these conversations that we're having together, let's go into those with those courageous conversations, those agreements that most of us are familiar with. And if they're not, let's go over it really quickly, which is being able to understand and interrupt and dismantling internal and external racism is a constant for all of us who are seeking those equitable outcomes and resources for homelessness response systems and those other systems that we all engage in. And so we're asking throughout this journey that we're taking together today is that we stay engaged. We expect to experience discomfort. We would like for you, as Vivila has talked about, to speak your truth, and then also expect and accept a lack of closure. And throughout the last webinar and this webinar, we are going to be choosing truth over comfort. And that is to acknowledge and correct the pathways of how this country was created and is still operating under. And it only occurs with recognition, truth, and understanding that leads the way to be able to correct those paths. And then you'll see here on your slide a self-care wheel, experiences of racism and hearing the harsh truths of racism and the history can build on each other and can chip away at your emotional, physical, and spiritual being. So in the chat soon, you'll see some resources, some links for yourself, your team, and your community as you journey through this understanding of not this topic, but all the topics or all the systems that have been created in our country in equity, and how do we resolve, acknowledge, and move forward on a path of reconciliation and justice.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Lori. So to catch us up and remind us of what we are bringing forward from our last session, we'll have a few highlights. So we learned that California has a very large Native American community, and it's largely comprised of California tribes, out-of-state tribes, and a Native American urban population consisting of both out-of-state tribes and California Native Americans. Each of these groups have unique needs. We learned that there is no accurate source of data on Native American homelessness. We also learned that due to the impact of government policies towards Native Americans historically, they have greater barriers in addressing their problems and homelessness. A key point that we learned was that solutions that address homelessness in tribal communities require meaningful partnership from our COCs and all organizations. Next slide, please. Thank you. A couple more key points that we'll lift up before our discussion. So additional post-colonial impacts of our policies on Native Americans and government's impact in particular include disproportionate rates of homelessness, poverty, intergenerational trauma, mental health challenges, substance use disorders, and other poor health indicators. And we also learned that tribal communities require culturally responsive programs and resources that honor tribal sovereignty due to their unique political sovereign status. Next slide, please.
So at the beginning of this webinar, you heard V, Albert, and myself make our introductions in our own customary way. It was very individualized. It wasn't, we all introduced ourselves differently. But you did hear our linkage to our homelands. You heard us acknowledge the length of our people's history to that land and how we call ourselves or how we refer to ourselves. When interacting with Native individuals, it's important to understand that each person has experienced their cultural connection in a unique way. Some Native people will introduce themselves using their native language. Whether someone chooses to do this or not is their personal choice, and not doing so does not make them less Native. And remember that until very recently, most Native people were persecuted for speaking their languages, practicing their cultures, and for merely existing. Specifically for Native Hawaiians, our language was outlawed until the mid-1970s, outlawed in the books, a law. So the very act of self-identification was and is still sometimes seen as a huge risk for Native people, especially given the long history of mistreatment of Native peoples. There are those who choose to identify themselves as Native as a tool to combat invisibility and harmful stereotypes. So generally speaking, when being without a home for an Indigenous worldview is not simply a lack of accommodation or structural habitation, but rather this web of relationships that involves connections to the human kinship networks, relations to animals, plants, spirits, and elements, relationship to the earth, lands, waters, and connection to traditional stories, songs, teachings, names, and our ancestors. So in working with Native American individuals who are unhoused, it's critical to understand that simply a shelter does not always equal home, but the connectedness to our original place, where our people are rooted in our creation story and the legends that align us with the land and our traditions are also home to us. V will be discussing how deeply held values, general worldview, and patterns of communication and interaction are often the differences that affect the partnering relationship between local governments and service providers with tribal communities and Native American urban communities.
Thank you, Lori. Next slide, please. So here we have a list of cultural traits and values that we tend to attribute to Native American culture and to dominant society. So this information is helpful in the examination of how Native American traditional values are often the opposite of dominant society's values. So as you review this list with me, it's important to note that by sharing this, we are not advocating that one set of values is superior over the other. We're simply noticing that there are differences. So providing a couple of examples in what we have here, with dominant society, we tend to see that nature is exploited for personal benefit. And we can see this today if we look to our policies as it relates to environment and climate change. This is the opposite of Native American culture, which tends to live in harmony with the environment and nature. And that way of being is actually a part of the spirituality. In dominant society, up until recently, we have tended to see that dominant society will create a standard to which they believe is universal and applies to everybody. And if you don't fit that standard, there is something wrong with you and your culture. Of course, there are recent changes to this, and this is a part of what this presentation is about. And indigenous worldviews and Native American worldviews, we tend to see that there is more of an honoring of the diversity among people and cultures, so cultural responsiveness. So you may be looking at this list and saying, wait a minute, I'm a member of dominant society and I don't identify with all of these values. And what I would say to that is, it's similar with Native Americans as well. We are all acculturated at different levels. And so you'll see some people with very traditional values, and then you'll see some with a blend of values, and then you'll see some who may appear to have values like dominant society. Still, it's important to keep in mind when working with our tribal partners that the differences in cultural orientations impact how we see the world, how we approach partnerships, and how we communicate. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for some audience engagement. And I would like to find out from your perspective how my differences in cultures impede effective communication and partnerships. And so while you're thinking of your answer, please feel free to type in the chat and raise your hand. And Albert, if you don't mind, I'll just pass that question to you to see if you have anything to add. Is there anything in relation to communication that you've noticed in the differences and how they impact relationships between Native American and dominant societies' cultures?
Thank you, Bev. In listening to you present, I believe you and Lori, you covered it really well, and I think thoroughly. One of the things for me in working, even within our own tribal communities, is to understand that there are more than 570 federally recognized tribes. And the last presentation, you covered that, but just to reiterate that. And so the unique, and in California, we have the second most number of tribes, only to Alaska. So when you're thinking about tribal engagement to tribes across California, just remember that we don't all speak the same language traditionally. We don't all live in teepees, so some of the stereotypes. And it's important to know, and I think Bev covered it, is that many of us are multi-ethnic as well. And so you may have some of our relatives who are of the dominant culture of society, but also Native. And so we have assimilated and acculturated and indoctrinated, but reaching the actual tribal entities themselves, there's some things to consider when learning to engage. So thank you, Bev.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm looking for hands in the chat to see if anybody has anything they would like to share. And if my co-host or anybody sees hands that I'm missing, please let me know. Did you have anything that you felt like sharing with us?
We currently don't have any hands raised, and we don't have anything in the chat.
Okay, Thank you. Well, feel free. Oh, I'm seeing something now. Culture represents norms, rules, and values. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so that will absolutely impact our expectations in interactions and in dealings with other people. And it could impact how we even present ourselves. And this can set us up for a cultural mismatch or misunderstandings that have consequences.
I'd like to add also, Bev, is that in my own learning, education, growing as a human being, I've had to recognize my own implicit biases. And in the work that I do, I work in behavioral health. I work in tribal communities and the dominant society clinics and communities. And I've had to recognize my own areas of discrimination, of judgment, while learning to live, thrive, survive in the dominant society. And so I know that as a Native man, if I'm open and willing, we ask that we reach across the river for the same respect and acknowledgement. And I think that's so important, is that every day when I know I'm going to engage with someone from another tribe even, that I'm being thorough in my own implicit biases around communication, respect, knowledge for them and their history, their worldview, and their customs and traditions. So I just want to add that, Bev.
Thank you. Your timing couldn't be more perfect, Albert. Thank you for that. Before we move on to our next slide, which is going to set us up and educate us on implicit biases, I just want to acknowledge the folks in the chat. And so I'm seeing some comments about, the nature of outreach and how let me pull this up a little bit. The nature of outreach. Perhaps there are expectations culturally in outreach that are not being met by the other side because they have different understandings of what outreach is. And I'm glad you brought that up because we'll be talking about that today. And I see, feel that culture influences our response to others. It gives us the freedom to choose our responses to our world. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And please feel free to continue to share as we move on. Next slide, please. So we're setting you up internally so that you are situated in a good way to partner with tribal partners. And one of the reasons that I brought this up is because, first of all, we know how it is when we are having things happening in our own life, or if we're coming from a government office or an office oriented towards deadlines, that we can get caught up in that culture. And so it's good to take time to check in with ourselves as to how we're situated in our mental, emotional, and physical states. And it's critical that we have an understanding of what implicit biases that we bring to a conversation, to a partnership, and to the development of our programs and policies when we serve underserved communities. And Albert set that up for us perfectly. Implicit bias, though implicit prejudices are social preferences that exist outside of our conscious awareness. Implicit attitudes, of which implicit prejudice is a special case, are understood to reflect associations between social categories and evaluations. And so in essence, the way that our brains are formed, we develop categories and we quickly sort into categories when we're children. And this is how we sort in what is good, what is bad, what is dangerous, what is not. And as we do so, we soak in the values of our family and our culture. And we know that in dominant society, there are often stereotypes about Native American people and culture. And often people will not have exposure to many Native American folks to their knowledge. And so perhaps they'll be expecting Native Americans who are a particular shade of brown with feathers in their hair or something like that, or perhaps they'll pick up a negative stereotype that is not accurate. So the solution is to be aware of one's implicit biases, and we can do that because there are tests that help us to do so. So if you check your chat, you'll see a link to Project Implicit. This is a Harvard test that was developed to test our implicit associations. I encourage you to take the test for Native Americans. However, I want you to know there are tests for all sorts of groups. You can test your associations with young and old people and with other underserved populations. It's a great tool and it's highly recommended. Next slide, please. So debiasing tools. Debiasing tools are what help us to mitigate our biases. And an important point about biases is that we don't know that they're there. They have to do with decision-making processes that are under our awareness in the subconscious. And so debiasing tools help to get to that area of our brain so that we can override those subconscious states. Debiasing tools include a host of interventions, and we are including some resources for those interventions in the chat. Self-awareness of biases is the one critical intervention that we want to emphasize. However, we know that the agency that we work for and the culture that we are involved in influences our biases and how we'll interact with our partners. And so we encourage agency interventions, including things like having a culture that facilitates open discussions about our implicit biases and making sure that we aren't utilizing them in our decision-making processes. So not only will these debiasing tools help us with our engagement, but they can help us to create a more inclusive workforce, a more diverse workforce, and improve our outcomes for all communities when we apply them to all underserved groups. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide is actually a debiasing tool. This is called counter stereotyping. And it's showing the diversity of Native American skin. I'll say some diversity because there's much more diversity than this, but also shows success and contribution from Native Americans, which counteracts negative stereotypes that we've tended to see in the media over the years. We have Representative Ramos on the right. He's the first California Native to be elected to the California State Assembly. The Honorable Sunshine Seitz, the first Native American judge of the Superior Court of California for Riverside County. And on the left, we have John Harrington, the first Native American NASA astronaut. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Lori?
Yeah, thanks for that, V. And this is exactly like V said, a debiasing tool, right? So seeing Native representation in media and everyday role models for our youth and for each other. So one way that we're not seeing Native representation is in Congress. So as of September 13th of this year, after 230 years of history of Congress, we finally have a full U.S. Indigenous representation with the recent election of Alaska Native Representative Mary Baltola of Alaska, who joins the only ever Native Hawaiian ever represented in Congress, Representative Kaili Kahili, and also 6 other Indigenous Americans who also are representatives in the House. So again, after 230 years, we finally have a full U.S. Indigenous representation that's reflected in Congress. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk for a few moments here about cultural humility. And so, cultural humility may be a term that you're used to, a new term, but for these purposes, let's kind of ground ourselves in these 4 tenets. And cultural humility is an attitude of exactly what it sounds like, humility and respect toward other cultures that pushes yourself to challenge your own cultural biases and realize that you cannot possibly know everything about other cultures, but rather approach learning about other cultures as a lifelong goal and process. And there's 4 tenets of cultural humility. There's lifelong learning, self-reflection, mitigating power imbalances, and being comfortable not knowing. And we should add a 5th leaf here, institutional accountability. We learned in the last session that the track record of broken promises, broken treaties, and the ongoing purposeful tactics to dismantle our traditions, family structure, and very existence make those who identify as Native American weary and reluctant at times to partner and to share culture. So when we talk about accountability for a provider or for a government, really that goes back to you doing what you say you're going to do. Credibility and accountability goes back to when you say that you're going to do something, that you're going to follow through and implement it, in particular in policies. Next slide, please. So you'll see here a slide here, a Venn diagram around cultural humility versus cultural competence. We're going to shift that language around competence versus responsiveness. V and I had a really good conversation about this, and no one's ever going to be completely competent. I am not fully competent in my own Indigenous roots. And so really when we're talking about cultural competency, maybe we're talking more about cultural responsiveness. And so cultural responsiveness does not imply that one can be perfect or have attained all the skills and views needed to work with culturally diverse populations. Cultural responsiveness is also loosely defined as the ability to engage knowledgeably with people across cultures. And it's done with this assumption that the more knowledge we have about another culture, the greater we have the competence and our desire to partner and deliver services to people of a different culture. But cultural responsiveness or competence, whichever term you want to use, has 2 main problems. First, it suggests that there's a categorical knowledge threshold that a person can attain about a group of people, which leads to stereotyping, biasness, and it denotes that there's an endpoint to becoming fully cultural responsiveness. So again, that second main problem would be that there's an endpoint to becoming fully culturally responsive, like you're supposed to get some type of gift or certificate that says, okay, you are fully engaged and know everything that you need to know about Indigenous populations, go forth and do good. But that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for cultural humility. And that cultural humility involves understanding the complexity of identities, that even in the sameness, there is difference, and that a person or an identity will never be fully responsive about the evolving and dynamic nature of an Indigenous person and a Native American person's experience.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Lori. So as we discussed earlier, when we're communicating with people of different orientations, different cultural orientations, we need to be more aware and purposeful with our communications than we would otherwise. This is particularly important with our Native American peoples because of the historical relationship between the government and Native Americans, which has led to an understandable great distrust. Cultural misunderstandings not only create a problem in the delivery of services, but also the building of partnerships. So a communication sent with good intention can be received in a particular way, depending on how the receiver interprets that communication and how the communication is delivered, like, for example, with tone and nonverbal communications. So with that in mind, we have just a few tips for communication. These include being honest and clear and checking in for shared mutual understanding, because we often have different meanings for the same words. I can tell you with Lori and I working together for this presentation, we're both Indigenous and in the same field, and yet we were also having to check in with each other. And is this what this means to you? And we actually had different meanings as well. Do not make assumptions about what another's silence means. Practice inclusion. So if there's a silence, you'll want to ensure that they know they have the opportunity to provide feedback, that provide space for them to take it back to their community to consider it and then provide feedback. But then you also want to respect boundaries so that you're not too intrusive. So perhaps they do just need some more space. We recommend that you listen more than you speak. You do not ask intrusive questions. Be aware of your own nonverbal communications. We recommend that you learn to be comfortable with long pauses in conversation. And I know this can be difficult for some folks. I also really like to ponder information when I receive it so that I can consider the response. And that makes some people uncomfortable. But we're suggesting to learn to work through these things and give space for these conversations. And then, of course, do not impose your own personal values and beliefs. Next slide, please. Okay, outreach. Who to contact, how to contact them. So, tribes, as sovereign governments with great diversity among them, will be organized differently. And this has implications for who you contact in tribes. For example, every tribe will not have a housing director. Some tribes will not have a housing department. Tribes have varying types of organization, capacity, and staffing. Should you want to reach out to Native American urban tribal communities, there are also different types of contacts. So for tribes in particular, what we did and what I would recommend is to obtain the telephone number for the tribal office from the Federal Register. Sometimes I would verify online that it's the same number, because sometimes information can change on the Federal Register and not be updated. And then call and inquire who the best person to speak to is. And what I would do sometimes is contact the receptionist, ask if there's a housing director, and if there was not, explain who I was and the purpose for my call. And there were times that I was connected to social service directors, I was connected to chair people, and I was connected to secretaries for tribal council. So it can really be a variety of folks. In some cases, it'll also be a tribal administrator. To conduct outreach in Native American urban communities, however, you'll want to find the urban community centers in your area. So for example, in Oakland, we have the Intertribal Friendship House. This is a center where they have cultural activities, and it's a great spot to connect with, to do outreach to the urban Native American community there. I've personally hosted listening sessions there. There's also the Friendship House in San Francisco. In Los Angeles, we have United Auburn, or United UAIC, and that is an American Indian urban organization that also offers cultural and treatment services for the community. And so if you contact these centers, then you can find out, just ask them who is the correct person to speak with. I usually request the director and then go from there, explain my project and get next steps. That is all for this one. Oh, quick note. We are placing some resources in the chat. That includes the Federal Register list of federally recognized tribes in California. And we're also placing a list there that includes tribes in each county in California. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's important to address people appropriately and respectfully in order to build relationship. Government positions in tribal governments are to be addressed like we address high-level government officials in our own governments. My recommendation is to address chairpersons and individuals with similar positions as presidents of their nation. So regard them as they're in a presidential position. When addressing them is appropriate, it's important to address them as chairperson and then use their last name. When meeting with tribes and tribal communities, it's important to allow them to bring whomever they need to meetings and discussions, as there may be wisdom keepers in the tribes that need to help inform their decisions, such as elders. It's important to provide the same respect to them. Quick tip, if individuals chat with you casually behind closed doors, still be sure to use their formal titles in public. And be sure to address, as I mentioned, everyone with respect and kindness regarding their position, regardless of their position. And I can provide an example of an incident that I'm aware of where there was an individual working to engage the Native American community and had very good intentions and put together a tremendous amount of work to do a good job in their work with the Native community. And yet when they were on site implementing that work, they made some rude comments to people in lower level positions in that tribe. And that contributed to a bad reputation. And so we don't want to see folks make those same mistakes. And that's another reason why it's important to really be aware of your state of mind and your stress level when engaging our tribal partners. Next slide, please. Okay, agenda development and event planning. So it's recommended that agendas be developed collaboratively whenever possible, including giving your tribal partners adequate time to consider, request, and respond. So it's a good idea to ask if it's appropriate to include a space for a blessing in the agenda. That's something I always like to do because the meetings that I've been in, whether I've worked for tribes or worked with governments, have included both parties have always had a blessing. However, the community you're working with may not need that. So it's good to ask. On event location, when working with tribal partners, it's recommended to meet them at their locations whenever possible, when invited, or in neutral locations. So don't make them always travel to your government offices. In introductions, I would recommend first showing respect to your tribal partners by introducing the tribal government that's present, and then tribal community partners. I have been a part of meetings with government and tribal community in which the government facilitators will introduce all government staff and then defer to the tribal community to introduce themselves, and it just doesn't come across well. I would recommend having food and refreshments, even a meal if possible. Ensure there is time built into the agenda that allows space for tribal partners to fully share. And again, this can be hard for us in government when we're on quick deadlines and have a tremendous amount to pack in a small agenda. However, it's important to remember the cultural orientation of relationship and the value of relationship above deadlines in these moments. And so if you create extra space, it can suit both purposes. And it's important to be transparent. And this can be done in part by sharing notes of a discussion afterwards and confirming that nobody has any changes. So with that, Lori, I just wanted to check in with you and see if you had anything to add to this one.
Fabiola, I think you did a beautiful job outlining some real particular skills and tools and thoughtfulness around the agenda development and event planning. And I want to kind of double down on the transparency portion of this. And, transparency allows for this open recognition of challenges and the mistakes, and acknowledges that every mistake is an opportunity for growth and development. And by being very clear that we may have misstepped, we didn't offer a blessing, or we didn't make room for you to help craft the agenda. Being able to share those missteps with your Native American partners allows for them to recognize the humility and the dedication to improving that partnership and the issue that you're seeking to solve together. And again, creating a collaborative environment that is informed by placing the highest value on the perspectives of tribes and Native American urban communities is key to that shared decision-making through this meaningful engagement.
Thank you so much, Lori. Next slide, please. And I'm just putting a note in the chat in case anybody wants to share any tips that they have in these types of events or partnerships with agendas. Please feel free. I am always learning personally, and I'm sure after this presentation, I'll continue to learn about some things that perhaps we missed that we could have brought up. And so I encourage you, those who are with us today, continue to help me learn in improving our collaboration with our tribal partners in meetings and otherwise. So challenges engagement. So this is going to be a long one. I just want to let you know this is going to be a long one. I'm going to go through as quick as possible, and we're going to have a discussion afterwards. And so this is a good spot to share your experiences or ask questions after we cover the slide. Okay, so if you have been implementing the suggestions provided thus far in this presentation, you will reduce the likelihood of having these challenges in engagement. And that's why we're sharing that with you. However, when challenges do arise, know that it is normal, particularly when we are in government positions, because again, the way government works and the way tribal communities are, these are often opposite. So a few tips. So if a tribe is not responding, I would consider the method of attempted communication and whether you have reached the right person. So to provide examples, I've been in positions where I've worked for counties, and their method of outreach was sending emails to folks in the tribe. And I've even seen it used to say, like, for a requirement for a grant, well, they'll say, well, you need to do outreach to your local tribal partners. And their outreach would be sending emails to the last person they heard worked for the tribe some time ago. And then they would just write in their grant, well, there's no contact from the tribal partner, they're not interested. What I would encourage you to do, as I shared, would be to call, find out who the current person is, the correct person is, and then give them a call, leave a voicemail, follow up with an email. And then if you don't hear back after some time, follow up again. Being consistent is critically important, not only due to the capacity issues that many tribes have, because how busy folks are, an individual can be covering 4 positions and have a host of responsibilities, but also because there can possibly be turnover, such as in tribal leadership or in positions. So I covered the first and last one with that one. And again, our tribal partners, if you have anything you wanted to add, please feel free to in the chat, or we'll have an opportunity to chat in a moment. So bring tribal partners into planning and partnerships as soon as possible. So it sometimes doesn't feel like a genuine partnership when we're brought on as partners on a project that is already designed without our input. Then it seems like an afterthought. So, however, if we're in a situation where, sometimes we arrive new to a position, a project is already planned, and now it's our role to reach out to folks, then we be transparent and we have humility about the situation, knowing that perhaps because of whatever barriers we face or whatever reason, we messed up in that situation. So for those of us who work in government, the challenges inherent in our bureaucracies are not always most conducive to building relationships with tribal communities. And if I was in church with that one, I would say, can I get an amen to that one? Sometimes the processes we have to go through do not make sense to people who don't work with us. And sometimes they don't make sense to people who work within bureaucracies. But one example of that is the level of secrecy that we sometimes have to have. Sometimes there's information that tribal communities really need to know, and unfortunately, we're unable to share. So a point that I've made, and I'll just make again briefly, if people have not prepared themselves for partnership or having a bad day, it's easy for someone to say something in a tone and it to be received in a particular way. There are occurrences of even microaggressions, insults or slights that include racial stuff. So I'd really encourage you to check your biases and how you're doing before you outreach. Another tip to avoid these, give tribal partners as much notice as possible, as mentioned. If we say we want a partnership and don't demonstrate the behaviors of partners, our tribal partners may feel that their feedback and presence is not valued. And so that addresses this one here, asking for partnership, but not sharing power and decision-making. And so when this happens, it's important for us to have communication with our partners, receive this information with humility, and check ourselves and improve ourselves where we can. I recommend that wherever possible, provide stipends for individuals participating in things such as advisory groups, or perhaps if they were to help you develop something like a tribal consultation policy. This will vary according to what type of project you have. And CalReal and I can also help you, if you're wondering what's appropriate for a stipend, what's not. I would always shoot for writing funding for stipends and travel reimbursement for our tribal partners wherever possible. And of course, be aware of accessibility options. And then, as I've touched upon, absence of humility and our conflict resolution skills. It's good to, our staff that are working with tribal partners, not only do we want them to have cultural humility and good communication skills, but also conflict resolution, because there may very well be some times where there's tension in the room, and we want them to be able to handle that in a good way that preserves relationship as much as possible. So with that, I would like to open it up for discussion. Participants who are with us today, have you had any experiences with challenges in engagement that you've overcome that you would like to share? I'm not including any particular names or identifying information. Or do you have anything else you would like to share related to engagement? We'll open it up for a few minutes. Okay, we're just going to pause for a few minutes just in case anyone's looking for their raised hand symbol at the bottom of the screen. If you want to share something, we want to make sure you're involved. Feel free to also share in the chat. And if you're feeling shy today or just take it all in, that's fine. We're just happy that you're with us today.
Bavila, we have a raised hand. Madeline, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I was responding to the prompt about whether there was a challenge we encountered that we overcame. And I have an example I can share of this. And it's really related to the point about some tribal communities prefer to build a relationship before engaging in business. And that was the experience I encountered, because I started in the role of housing coordinator with my current agency in winter, and they wanted me to engage with a tribe around the pit and tick. And they had really good reasons for wanting that information, but it was there was conflict in the engagement and the communication, because my agency was, working on requirements and processes and, requesting information from the tribe as opposed to collaborating. And so since then, it's been about 2 years, and I switched to doing phone calls and just calling to tell them what we were doing. We're working on this or that service, just to let you know that it's there, and asking them what were their current projects around housing, and developed a relationship with the director, and invited them to attend COC meetings and listen in. And then they eventually applied to be a member, and they're now a member of the COC. And this year have volunteered to take part in the point in time count, and to engage themselves on a whole new level. So this was just a challenge that I walked into, and have seen a lot of progress over 2 years since developing the relationship more.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is an absolute perfect illustration of what we've been covering today, and the need to build relationship and the importance of relationship before getting to business. And I want to acknowledge you for that partnership. And if your organization is willing to share your story, we may be having a feature in the near future highlighting partnerships and best practices between COCs and tribes. So if that's something you'd be open to, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you again for sharing that. Albert, I see you coming off. First, before I go to Albert, I'm just going to see if anybody else raised their hand first.
We don't have any other hands raised, but we do have a comment in the chat from Michelle. Michelle says, I always go in with a level of respect to all those I come in contact with, and I'm mindful that I ask questions to ensure I don't do anything that's considered disrespectful to those I'm engaging with.
Very important in cultural humility. Thank you so much for lifting that up and for sharing that, Rachel. Albert, do you have anything you'd like to add? I'm sure you've seen quite a bit over the years.
No, I just wanted to acknowledge the last person that spoke, and you reiterated the importance of establishing relationship. It's actually a tribal custom and tradition to establish relationships with your neighboring tribes, right? And with each other amongst our villages, our clans, whatever that would be for your people. And one of the other things is you talked about the importance of giving, right? So gifting is really important from tribe to tribe. And I know for me, when I've established relationships with maybe a tribal organization or tribal government, and I know I'm going to meet with them, I learn what is appropriate gifting. And I usually will bring a gift. Maybe it's medicine, or something that just shows that sign of respect for those people once I build that relationship. So I love the idea of when you shared you offer stipends. The stipends are important, but those gifts are as well. And it could be something small, and it could be something, a little bit more costly, but it doesn't always have to be something that costs a lot of money. Right? And it comes from your spirit, your heart. And so I just wanted to offer that as well in helping establish those relationships.
Thank you so much. That is so helpful, and I'm glad you brought that up. I have an example for folks. I was invited to an event with a tribe several months ago, and in that case, I brought sage from my garden, and I brought it for the elders of the tribe who were there and a part of the event, and was introduced to them. And it was a really good way to build relationship. And I know others there who also brought vegetables from their garden to the elders on that day. But I do sometimes get contacts from folks who are wondering, like, what can I give? I'm going to visit this tribal community. And so if you can't think of something, and perhaps you're not familiar with the community, that's one of the reasons why I recommend bringing good food and refreshments. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I do is, for example, I've been to the East Coast with some of the relatives there, Six Nations people, and I wasn't sure, you know, because I know in our region we use our medicines, and almost nationally folks have adopted using white sage, and you know there are different variations of sage all across the lands. So I called my contact there and I just simply asked the question. It's a respectful question. You know, what would be appropriate? What is an appropriate gifting? And they gave me some feedback on what that is. So that's my recommendation is if you don't know, call your contact, ask. It usually, most, I know our people, they respect that you took the time to ask, that you want to be respectful and not stereotypical, because sometimes in our best efforts we do that. I do it, and without thinking, I'm thinking, oh, that's appropriate for my people, so it must be all right for them, but you never know. And so I always just call, ask if you have a contact.
Really good advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we're getting ready to transition to the next slide, but my parting statement for this slide, I'll just like to add, I've been in positions in which I've been in between tribes and government, either for the tribe or for the government, for the last 22 years. And as I said, utilizing the cultural humility mindset, I am always learning. And also, even with this experience, I am also not perfect and sometimes make mistakes that I learned from. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So with that, next slide, please.
All right, thank you. I think that folks have seen this and seen this before. So we get into what it looks like to apply a racial equity lens for implementing HAP system performance goals. So why does this live here? Well, we know that communities are participating and completing HAP applications, right? And within those HAP applications, more specifically the HAP 4 applications, you know, we want to make sure or ensure that folks are thinking and prioritizing Indigenous and tribal populations. And so within that, giving some resources to think about how one might develop those goals in community. And so I'll read some of these for like folks who are driving or multitasking or doing what you're doing on that end. This is what this looks like. What are the race equity goals for your local homelessness response system? And so again, it's about, you know, setting those goals. It's about how are we being accountable to Native American tribes and Native American urban communities? Are we accountable to our other entities, populations, Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Latina, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and persons with lived expertise in the process? And so as we are establishing the goals with the racial equity lens, you know, it's how might we be more accountable to people with lived expertise? There are people who are closest to the problems. How are we maximizing benefit and minimizing harm to tribes and Native American urban communities, Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islanders, and persons with lived expertise in this process? And so how might we maximize benefit and minimize harm? what are the systemic and institutional barriers in place that act as additional constraints for tribes and Native American urban communities? What are interventions to remove barriers to ensure equitable outcomes? And so again, it's about how might we, as we are constructing these goals for funding, how might we identify the problems? How might we remove some of the barriers that prevent us from promoting equity in spaces? How are we monitoring our progress to ensure that we are iterating rapidly to meet the goals while being accountable to those most impacted? And so there's this notion that we have to keep, you know, testing and repeating processes, and which comes from that continuous quality improvement piece. And so again, adding this in because we know that applications have dropped. We know that people are working on, you know, tailoring and revising those goals. One of the things that we didn't see last round, HAP 3, is that the majority of folks did not prioritize or name goals specific to tribal and indigenous populations, right? That rolls a flag for us, that rolls a red flag for us, as we know that, you know, the state of California has many tribal and indigenous populations. And so this is just another resource to consider as folks are re-envisioning what those goals look like for this specific population. Nice. Something else here, and Lori, thank you. You put it into the chat. We are still supporting communities with HAP applications as requested. And so if there's any questions around how you might tighten up your goals or be more specific about how you want to serve indigenous and tribal populations, Lori dropped the email down below in the chat. So feel free to reach out. All right. Fabiola.
Next slide, please. Thank you so much. Okay, we're now going to open up the floor for questions and answers. Please feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you have comments, please feel free to press the raised hand at the bottom of the Zoom screen and let us know you'd like to speak or place items in the chat. And again, always, if you want to connect with me afterwards, if something has arisen, if you'd like to share something with me or ask something, please also feel free to reach out to me personally. So we'll pause for a few minutes.
Maybe I can get us start. Maybe I can help get us started with
Excellent.
some dialogue and discussion around questions and answers. When presenting on the debiasing techniques, I noticed in the chat that many people haven't heard of debiasing. And okay, Leanne, I'm gonna call you out. And Leanne had mentioned, you know, they had done some debiasing techniques in a community, and just wondering like what if folks have some examples of like what the debiasing techniques look like, or, you know, in practice, maybe that folks have done. Because I think that's a new terminology to most folks on the call.
Excellent question. So we'll open it up.
If anybody wants to come off mute. Yep. If anybody wants to come off mute and like talk about it a little. Leanne also mentioned, if I can read this out loud, when talking about the debiasing tools and techniques, when training for response and advocacy, it helps to understand why we think and feel the ways we do. It will impact the way we respond to another person. We ask volunteers and staff to take a deep dive as they commit to balance in space and understanding that they may never get to why.
That's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that. I saw a sure from, I thought it was Leanne in the chat, so I'm going to look for her now and see if she's ready to chat.
Hi.
Hi,
You
Leanne.
guys-
Hey, Leanne.
Hey, how are you? Sorry about that. We have two different sessions going on in the same room, so it was kind of hard to hear you. Do you kind of want to repeat what you were saying?
Sure. I was talking about the debiasing techniques that you all had used or practiced in community. And just wondering if you could just share a little bit more about like how you utilize or want to use the debiasing techniques in community.
So as we sit with volunteers and staff, it's a 40-hour training session that we kind of go through. And throughout that training session, we touch on different triggers. We touch on different pieces of their lives that create that response. So throughout those 40 hours, there's going to be different parts of the conversations that unravel different pieces of themselves. And it's conscious but unconscious unraveling, I guess you would say. I could get into more details, but it's kind of, it would be one of those things that you would have to look at our training and our education that we do with the women and the men that we work with. But it's all based around how we're going to respond to a situation where there's someone who has had a really bad time, and it may be a child, it may be a woman, it may be a man, and that person may be an addict. They may be very different than us, and we need to respond. We need to show up and respond to that with an open heart and open space so that we can best support them in any type of a situation that's going to develop in that moment. And it takes time to get to, as a person, to realize that I may have a bias because of something that's happened to my life. So yeah, throughout the 40-hour training, we're throwing in little pieces of that debiasing technique so that we can uncover those things from people. And it's not like a whole 40 hours of this training. It's 2 hours here, 2 hours there, and by the end of the training sessions, you've realized that you've touched so many different places. So I'm sorry it's not more concrete than that, but okay.
No, that was a wonderful explanation. Thank you. I'm hoping that we can adopt some of the tools and techniques in this space to teach others across our communities and grantees and racial equity work. So thank you, Leanne. Any other questions for Lori and Vavila? Any feedback for Lori or Vavila? Okay. Well, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for further conversation, plenty of opportunity to ask questions, and lots of opportunity to join the California Phase 2 Intensive and Moderate Initiative. I wanted to make sure that folks are adept with the resources provided within the chat. Also, as Lori and Vavila mentioned, the resources will be going out a little bit later on this week. Vavila, Lori, is there anything else we want to mention before we part?
Yes, please. And thank you so much for facilitating that conversation. Could we go to the next slide, please? So in wrapping up, I just want to thank everybody who joined us today. We know that you all have very busy schedules. I want to acknowledge that we featured the artwork of Bobby Von Martin today throughout this presentation. He is a member of the Choctaw Nation who resides here in California in the Central California region. I want to acknowledge CalReal for the support in this presentation and solidarity, and also our Cal ICH support and leadership for supporting us and helping us to elevate these conversations. CalReal, is there anything you would like to add before we close out?
I don't think so. Just thank you so much for being in community, participating in conversation and being engaged today. Thank you for our coaches who showed up to support the engagement today. And we appreciate this partnership. Nice job.
Thank you. And just two final things. So there will be a survey. If you have any feedback to help us improve, please let us know. I'm always looking to improve the information we provide, make it most relevant to you, and improve your experience. So also these will be available on recording, and we will also be providing handouts of the resources that we provided in both presentations. Thank you so much, everybody. Good to see you today.